Hi, everyone. Welcome to our discussion on There Be Dragons. This is part of the Legend Haven Con if you're watching it live. Otherwise, catching the replay, I'm your host, Dominic, founder of LegendFiction. We are joined today by Katy. Hi, Katy. She is one of our fantastic mentors in the Legend Fiction community. How are you, Katy?
Good. How are you doing, Dominic?
I'm good. You just got back from New Zealand you were there for what, 2 weeks or something?
Yep. It's
Yep.
basically Middle Earth. It was awesome.
Oh my goodness. I was born there. So it's so funny to now we both have connection to New Zealand. You saw what, kiwi birds and fairy penguins, and you learned to say hello in Maori.
Yeah, Kia ora. I learned that on the plane. And then there was just a lot of me chasing around New Zealand birds and looking into penguin burrows, and which is probably kind of rude. Like if some giant just looked into your house and was like, "Oh, you're so cute. I want to give you a hug," you probably would freak out, but I couldn't help it.
Yeah. Well, that's a great metaphor for where we're going, because the sense of a giant face peering in your burrow, it's a good metaphor, I think, for this conversation, because we want to talk about dragons. And the key thing that came up when we first kicked this off was people were like, "Oh my God, dragons? They're evil, aren't they? They're bad. Is it okay for Christian people to write about dragons or put them in stories? But what happens when a dragon is a good thing? Or what about movies like How to Train Your Own Dragon, where they're just misunderstood? Is this a problematic thing for Christians? And so we got these questions coming in, and so we decided, okay, we just need to have a talk about this. And more importantly, first of all, dragons are awesome. If you disagree, well, I'm very sorry, but dragons are awesome. Now, in what case or context, that's kind of the key thing, and that's kind of what we're going to talk about. So this might be like a little Dragons 101, and certainly these are our opinions from a faith-based, faith-inspired background, but also looking at the fact that there are multiple cultures with multiple takes on dragons, some religious and some based in story. And then there's the secular modern culture with its take on dragons and what we can learn from that. So for this discussion, we're not so much talking about dragons in a religious sense, because especially if you're faith-based Christian, Orthodox, Catholic or something, then dragon is used usually in a specific sense. I don't think it's universal, but it's pretty generally used as a symbol for something that is evil, something that we have to deal with. But in a storytelling sense, which is informed by our liturgy and our religion, but also which informs the liturgy and religion back as well. So they talk together. That's why faith-inspired fiction is incredibly important. That they mutually, affect each other. So we're talking mostly from a storytelling standpoint, because that's what people really want to hear when they pick up our stories and novels. Is they want stories, not evangelization. So any initial thoughts, Katy, before we start diving in?
Yeah. Well, first of all, as Dominic said, this is our opinions, and you are welcome to disagree, because we welcome that kind of dialogue, any kind of dialogue on the Catholic author community, or the legend fiction community, as it now is. So just hear our opinions, and then after this, comment with your own opinions. What do you think? Are we right? Are we wrong? Are we partially right? Go for it.
Good. Thanks, Katy. All right. Well, let's talk about, if I could ask you, what's the obvious assumption about dragons? Like, you scratch a Catholic or an Orthodox, there seem to be some just obvious assumptions about dragons that we're horrified when we see that reversed in movies or stories, or maybe it's like a guilty pleasure. It's like, okay, little Game of Thrones here, maybe, or How to Train Your Own Dragon, or maybe Avatar with their dragon riders. And we're like, oh, that's just cool, but actually we can't actually include that maybe in our own stories, because what reasons? What do most people think when they think of a dragon?
Dragons are the embodiment of Satan.
Why? Where do we get that? Where does it actually come from?
Yeah, I mean, the most obvious example is the Bible, right? So the serpent in the garden, in the Hebrew, that's Nahash, which is not actually like a snake; it's a dragon, or it's a big monster type of thing. The dragon in Revelation as well. That's always kind of this in the Bible, throughout the Bible, is representing the devil in a lot of cases, or it's representing evil. So if we're looking at picking up the Bible and we want to just use biblical dragons as every dragon, then that's the conclusion people can jump to from that.
Mm-hmm. I remember this whole discussion about dragons is something very, how do I say? It's like very personal to me. A couple of years back, I think Aragon had just come out. Excuse me, and I had started reading it, and at the time I didn't like it too much. Partly I didn't like the style, and also I thought, oh my goodness, he's making you love dragons, and this is bad, and this is a problem and stuff. And then my cousin came along, and she was like in love with the series, and I thought, oh no, I have to rescue her. I'm going to create a trilogy where dragons are the bad guys, and I'm going to explain why they're so dangerous for everything. I never ended up writing that series. I still want to one day because it's actually a fun sort of thing in its own right. But I needed to then do actual research into what dragons were about. And the more I dug into it, dragons in ancient cultures, dragons in different cultures, dragons in the Christian tradition, the more I began to realize what I thought I knew about dragons was one very specific thing. And like you mentioned, mostly from sacred scripture, maybe from what's referenced in Mass or Compline or something like that. But that's only one part of the puzzle. And I remember actually pulling aside an Orthodox, I think it was Orthodox, or he was Ruthenian Byzantine or something, and I asked him, what is a dragon in the ancient world? How should we think about this? And what I wanted to hear was what you just said. They're an embodiment of evil. And he didn't give me that. He actually said something that I refused to listen to for almost a decade. He said dragons they're an ancient symbol of power and chaos. And that's why ancient kings, like in Wales or in China, would take the symbol of the dragon, because it was all chaos is not always a bad thing. Chaos is a state of receptivity. Chaos and power must exist together. And you cannot control it. You coexist with it. You learn to manage it. It's not what I wanted to hear. I ignored him. And I went back to trying to write my novel. Well, I've kept reading and learning since, and paying attention to all of the fun stories that have been told in modern culture and so on. And as we were putting together this con, I began to realize, okay, we're missing an opportunity here to have fun conversations with people, and not just fun, valuable conversations with people, maybe even have the permission to tell some of the dramatic dragon-infused stories that we want to tell, because we're too reductive, we're too simple about our assumptions about dragons. And I like the metaphor of imagine a rose window, like from the Cathedral of Chartres, right? Or Our Lady of Paris, beautiful stained glass window. Now imagine invaders take that window and they extract it from the cathedral and they cart it back home, and then they run tests on it and they try to understand the story of it and they try to reconstruct its meaning and so on. But the problem is that window existed in a context. It was made to be part of a much larger catechism in stone and light, made by people who were working in concert with other people trying to tell stories for that area of that time. And that's what sacred scripture actually is. It was not written by medieval minds. It's written by ancient Hebrew minds. And it existed as a tapestry of stories from the Canaanite, Egyptian, Sumerian, Babylonian time frame. So we then have to reground. This is what a lot of scriptural exegesis is now doing today, is we realize we've been I think the word is eisegetic, too much eisegesis, reading into it what we want to see, as opposed to the exegesis, allowing it to tell us what it is saying. I think dragons have the same sort of thing. We've been too eisegetic. We've been looking into it because we have a very Western first world Nordic dragon thing. And because we're in America and we're primarily British, or if you're maybe in first world anywhere, we mostly have popularized Western dragons. But you go to South America, dragons are very different. You go to China and pretty much anywhere in Asia, dragons are very different. And there's something to learn from that. It doesn't mean that they're all, they've just given in to the wiles of the evil. And it's like, no. And this is where we were going to go with this discussion is, I think the kind of dragon that we have popularized is only one kind of dragon. And I'd like to talk about maybe 3 different kinds. So first, can we talk about what is a symbol? Because effectively, dragons don't actually exist. They never actually existed. No, they're not dinosaurs with wings. Maybe people looked at them and bones in the ground and so on, but that's also way too materialist a way to look at it, because every culture everywhere has some kind of dragon. So it is a symbol. So how would you define a symbol, Katie?
The simplest explanation would say something that stands for something else. And the most obvious example, I think, would just be words and language, right? So, for example, I could say horse, and that is a word that symbolizes a real animal that exists. So it symbolizes a reality, right? But for example, even in English, sometimes we use the same word to mean two different things. So, pear, like there's like 5 different meanings for the words pear, whether that's the action to cut, that same sound from your throat symbolizes a fruit. It symbolizes an action to cut, and it symbolizes 2 things. And the only way you can determine what that word symbolizes is through the context, or in some cases through the spelling. But if you're having a conversation, right, you have to listen to the context of the conversation.
Yeah. That's why transcribing, I watched this super fun show over the weekend, and it's set in India. And it's so funny watching this epic story being told, and then me realizing whatever they're translating, I'm not fully going to understand, because I don't fully understand Indian culture. So when they will use a word, for them it comes with a ton of connotations and intention, and I'm reading into it my understanding of that. And it is a good question. Who's to say it's not that one is better? It is certainly that one is different. And that's why being exposed, or it's like foraging or eating widely, is key to a fantastic immune system. And with our modern culture, modern world, have a sense of your own culture, but also have a sense of openness to everything that is good that can be learned from other cultures. So this point about a symbol, and this is why dragons are such a great discussion, because if a dragon is not a material being, it's not a dinosaur and it never was, you can't travel somewhere and see them, flying Gila monsters, therefore it is something symbolic. And the fact that it exists everywhere tells us that it is something more than just what we observe in the material world. And actually, the more that we do get into, like, you read every story about them that's out there, you begin to realize dragons are, again, not a materialist thing that we create. They're part of the symbolic language of the angelic world. What does that mean? That means that when the numinous, or the angelic world, communicates to us, they do it in various ways, in various themes. They will pull on various images. And when they manifest or they show up, for example, when angels communicate to us, sometimes in our dreams, or like they have done to the prophets, when you're awake and get a waking vision, like Ezekiel, I think he was on the banks of, what was the river? The Jordan. And then he sees these incredible 4-beast thing with the head of a man and wings and a lion and a bull and so on. It just... These are symbols that the angelic world uses. They're recombining things from a material world around us, because unless they do that, we have no idea what they're talking about, which is why, most people, when they see angels, one, they're absolutely terrifying, or like as Ezekiel points out, I see wings everywhere and eyes everywhere. I have no idea what that means. But the angels are using things that are part of our context, part of our environment, and then recombining them to tell us something new. So dragons emerge to us from that context. But I think a problem is that we're so used to thinking of dragon as one specific thing, which is what's been popularized for us in the last several hundred years through different media. But also we've got the one dragon, for example, from scripture, which is not all dragons. It's specifically speaking about one kind of dragon that exists in that angelic reality, that is functioning in a specific way. I think a really great example is like a lion. I think it's St. Paul who describes the devil as a lion, and be watchful for it, because he runs around roaring, and he's going to defeat you. He's hunting you. But then you have Christ, and he's also the Lion of Judah. And then there's the angels appearing to Ezekiel as this lion-headed thing. So what is it? Is it an evil symbol? It's like, well, no, it depends on the context. Just like a
Mhm.
word, it depends on the context. So do symbols. And so we have to be careful about constricting a symbol ever and always, in all times and in all cultures, to meaning one thing when it's not exactly true. The things that are true and part of human universal experience are the things behind the symbols that the symbols are trying to articulate, such as ultimate good, max, whatever ultimate evil means, God, angelic beings, the human person, creation. Those are things behind the symbols that we use symbols to articulate and talk about.
And I think
What do you
that
think?
I think that one thing that's important, especially when we're talking about the Bible or just in general, I've heard people heard people say like, I want to use like a dragon in my book, but I'm really concerned it will like mislead people. They get the wrong idea from it. So one thing I would say about that, because we've been talking a lot about biblical dragons and the cultural context of that, if you just read the Bible with no guidance, no understanding of the cultural context of any of these things, I've heard people use the Bible to justify anything, right? Because they'll take one
Right.
part of it out of context, right? The I guess most extreme example is I've heard it used to justify polygamy. Like, oh, any kind of relationship is okay because Abraham had more than one wife. So Jacob had more than one wife, right? But if you know the context, you know that a lot of things the early patriarchs did that they considered perfectly fine. God later forbids in like the Leviticus and Deuteronomy, right? So Abraham was married to his sister, and God later forbids that, right? But if you don't know that, you're just like, oh, Jacob had more than one wife, so I guess it's okay to be in a polygamous relationship.
Right.
So you have to. People might always take what you say the wrong way. And, to a certain extent, you can caution against it, but you just can't blame yourself every time somebody reads the wrong message into your story, because a lot of that is coming from them, right?
Right.
Mhm.
No, that's very true. Another example of like a symbol that over time has been used in various ways is our beloved symbol of the cross.
Mhm.
It's so old. That is a symbol that Christianity did not create. It's a symbol from deep in the ancient world, and it means two things: the vertical and the horizontal. The vertical plane of heaven to earth, divine to mortal, and then the horizontal plane of creation, people to people, created thing to created thing. And then the junction point is human living or being alive, awareness, presence. But it's used as a symbol for life because you need both of those things happen together. You see this in ancient Egypt, and they put a loop on the top. It's basically that same symbol. You see this in ancient India. I mean, even modern day India, it's also seen as a swastika symbol with the curved or the bent ends. It's basically the same symbol. The Nazis took that and then they rotated it, trying to they borrowed that symbol for their own use and they gave it its own meaning. But it's a symbol for life. And that's one of the reasons, the irony why the Romans grabbed it was because, okay, we're going to use a symbol for life and make it about death. And I'm going to make it, thinking that, I don't know, maybe they thought they were being funny or something. And that's why we Christians went and took it. And we're like, this is one of the most beautiful symbols, challenging, it's dark, and it's like perennial. But the context of how it's used, how it's presented, and that's kind of the key thing. How it's presented determines this core idea. Like you take the symbol of a cross and you bend the ends and you rotate it, you've got something that nobody in wants to associate themselves with in the First World West. So you take a dragon with the deep idea of a dragon and you put it in a leathery back being breathing fire, and you've got Smaug, and it's obviously something narcissistic and evil. You put feathers and multicolors on it, and it's associated with water and pearls and luck, and that's what in China it's about, or in Asia, and I don't know enough about all of those other cultures. So most of our discussion is going to be, I think, helping us realize the Western contribution, I think, to a dragon is one. And actually, the modern world is now giving us another that I think is becoming more important. So the key thing we're wrapping up with here is context defines how we understand a symbol, because a symbol is trying to express something that exists behind that symbol, like a bigger reality. So I just want to share 3 kinds of dragons, and I was chewing through this idea, and I put it as a blog on the Legend Fiction website called There Be Dragons. Like I said, because dragons are awesome, and it's just understanding in what mode. The way that I see there are 3 kinds of dragons. There's the first kind of dragon, like Smaug or Glaurung, or dragon in like maybe sacred scripture, or it is an embodiment of evil, and it was meant to be. And like this is what Saint George goes out and does battle with. This is a very popular dragon in Western culture, Western first world culture. It is not the only one, but it's the one that we pretty much usually think of. But as you start to move into other cultures, you get over, for example, more to the Orthodox side, more to the sort of Middle East area, maybe. You have another story of Saint Simon Stylites, who has another story about a dragon. And if you don't know about Saint Simon, I think it was an early, I don't know if he's a church father, but he's in part of the early fathers of the church. And he went full on radical kind of guru sort of thing. I'm going to sit on a pillar out in the elements for, I don't know what he did, 40 years, the rest of his life, and purely to detach and meditate and reflect on the indwelling of God and so on. And then one day a dragon comes running out of a cave or something, and it's rampaging around, and it has a massive beam in its eye, causing it so much pain. And he takes the beam out of the dragon's eye, and it instantly calms down, and then it goes back to its cave. He doesn't kill it. He collaborates with it, or he takes care of it. So there's a different kind of thing going on here. That dragon has a conversion, because that beam in the eye is an obvious reference to something Christ said: take the beam out of your own eye before scrounging for the splinter in somebody else's. So when he took the beam out of that dragon's eye, he took a massive ego out of whatever this thing is, which means we're not talking about a symbol for ultimate evil. So we've got a different kind of dragon here that's, part of our past. And then there's a third kind of, it's a kind of dragon, and this is where where we're kind of going with this discussion, is the story of like Saint Francis. And there would be times where he'd be walking home and he'd be unsafe, and it'd be late at night, and I think he would pray to his guardian angel for help or safety from brigands. And a kind of enchanted wolf, Grigio, would appear, if I remember correctly, and would walk alongside him and take care of him and scare the bad guys away. And then when he was done, it would disappear and go away. Mm-hmm. And so those are the three kinds of dragons, mostly in the Western culture that we talk about. We won't talk so much about Eastern dragons. So these 3 kinds fascinate me, and especially with modern culture, because, like I said, there's a new kind of dragon that is like, if we were to give an example of it, like Godzilla, especially in the newest movies, is a big, massive, it is a dragon. Or the flying, mountain banshees from Avatar is a kind of dragon. Or it's not totally stretching it, but the Tyrannosaurs or the Indominus Rex from the Jurassic Park series, it's also a kind of dragon. And maybe there are, like Game of Thrones, Drogon, or what's the name of the really big one from the new season? I can't remember. Anyhow, this is a new kind of dragon that is not a supernatural being necessarily. I'm going to put like Smaug and Glaurung and Calagon from Tolkien up in that evidently evil, spiritual, possessed, demonic sort of thing. But then there's these other kinds of dragons that are very popular with modern culture today that are disconnected from this, like a spiritual evil, because they really are big flying dinosaurs. Mm-hmm. Or they're like Godzilla is this massive symbol for a power, a chaotic power in creation that we do not control, and that we're beginning to realize we can't control. And we have to learn to live honoring that, respecting that. It's not a dragon we've seen in the past before. It's become very popular today as we begin to realize we've gotten too big for our britches, and we're ruining the face of creation. We're ruining the earth, the environment. We're not respecting that. And we're putting ourselves in positions where that lack of respect is coming back and biting us very, very badly. in all kinds of ways. I'm going to stop for a second. What do you think about that?
Yeah, so I think kind of talking about the origin of all three of these kinds of dragons, right, is if you're living in the ancient world, you're living much closer to nature than we are today, right?
Mhm.
Today, we can look at Google Maps, we can see how big the world is. We kind of have a pretty good idea of what kind of animals are out there that are risky to us. But if you're in the ancient world, right, you've got crocodiles, you've got Komodo dragons, all kinds of monsters in the woods. So of course you're going to have these tales about, a crocodile with wings, essentially. Like, what kind of a monster is there out there that I don't know about, that I might have to fight or might have to face? That's just sort of an evolutionary instinct, and then it gets exaggerated into all these different kinds of stories, because there are large, dangerous animals out there that sometimes we can tame and control, but a lot of times we can't. And I think that that's the key to the whole thing, and that's the key to where all of these different legends come from, and why dragons don't necessarily have to be a supernatural evil. They can, in your story, be a natural evil, right? Or just a natural creature that's neither good nor evil.
Yeah, a natural like a natural force for something. And that's so with that kind of like big massive kind of dragon thing, like Saint Simon Stylites and that dragon, that was not a spiritual evil thing. He took care of it, honored what was a problem for it, and it returned back to a state of normal. And I think we're fascinated with those kinds of dragons. Like in Avatar, you must honor and respect the mountain banshee, and then you harness it. It's, again, we're not talking about harnessing a spiritual evil and bending it to your will. That is the kind of like, that's the mad dreams of like a black magician or something like that. And it's really, you're going to be played by that sort of thing. But these are not the kinds of dragons that we're telling stories about today. These have a different thing, a different message. But in a sense, it is still the same deep message being articulated through a symbol. What is the ultimate meaning of a dragon? It's everything in. I love how Jordan Peterson actually talks about this. A dragon is everything in your life that you're afraid to face, but when you do, you can learn something from it, and it will grow you through that point of conflict or challenge or something. And on the other side of that is something for you to learn. So dragons are this symbol for us of everything beautiful and dangerous that we must come into contact with. Some of them you have to kill. What that actually means, that's another discussion. But some dragons are meant to be killed, and we need those kinds of stories. Some dragons are tamed and respected and collaborated with because they're not an evil, they're a natural good, but they are a reminder that we exist in creation alongside it, and creation is full of power and full of chaos, and we have to find a way to balance that. We cannot eliminate it, and this is the problem with modern cultures. We've tried to crush down and make everything so neat and orderly, and it's so weird how we're telling stories about Godzilla and everything breaking and cracking all around us, because there's something deep in the human psyche that recognizes when there's too much order, that's a problem as well. But then there's a third kind, which is how to train your own dragon. Can you speak a little bit about that story? And then there's actually something to learn about that too, because it's like Grigio the wolf, kind of dangerous. He'll bite your hand off if you mistreat it. But there's also something friendly about this. And this is, I think, what people are concerned about maybe is, what do you do with a friendly dragon? I hope that we've now kind of knocked down some of the barriers to beginning to understand that it's not a problem anymore. Where would you go with that? Okay.
So the first thing that I would say is that God, right, a lot of God's creation is scary to us, right? Because God's creation is big and extraordinary and wonderful, and our minds are too small to comprehend it, right? And because we're fallen beings, we're afraid of things we don't know and things we don't understand. And I really like how C.S. Lewis talks about this, right? Because he tells the story in his space trilogy where Ransom is going through these tunnels and he sees these big insect-like things. and he's completely terrified and freaked out of these giant insect things. But then after the evil is defeated, he sees them again and he sees them as amazing and beautiful. Even though they're so different from him, just so beyond his comprehension that a fallen being has to be scared of them, right? We have to be scared of things because there are things in this world that are dangerous to us because we're fallen, we will die, right? So I think it's important to understand that just because something is scary or just because something is dangerous doesn't mean that it's bad.
Yes.
Dinosaurs are scary and they probably would be dangerous if they were around today, but God made them. Snakes freak me out. I don't like snakes very much. They're scary and they're dangerous, but God made them and God made them beautiful and God made them good. So that's the first thing I would say about that. The second thing regarding How to Train Your Dragon, right, is I've heard the argument about movies like that, you know, the dragon, the dad in that movie is saying dragons are bad, dragons are evil, right? And they're scary. And then the kids find out that no, dragons are not evil and scary. They're just misunderstood and they're nice. And the thing that I've heard from Christian parents about that is you're trying to endure children to evil, right? You're telling them that their parents are wrong and that actually this thing that's evil is actually just misunderstood and it's nice. And shouldn't we be very concerned about that as parents, right? And I think there is something to say. It's a different conversation about the problem with parents being portrayed as wrong as a trope in movies. That's a different conversation, and that is a problem. But I think where this not bad, just misunderstood thing is not so much the filmmakers trying to subvert evil, but it's because we live in such a culturally diverse society, right? And especially in the United States, you have tensions, not just like the racial tensions. I mean, that's the big one you think about when you think about people being afraid of each other and trying to learn to get along, but also you have, you know, different kinds of Europeans moving into New York, Philadelphia, right? And fighting with each other, bringing all their grievances that they had in Europe over and warring with each other. And then you have people coming from all around the world and meeting here, which is such a beautiful thing, but there's conflict as you start to set up that society.
Right.
And coming from that cultural context, the fact that we have this trope, it's not bad, it's just misunderstood, completely makes sense because the dragon that we've been trying to deal with for, you know, hundreds of years is this dragon of intolerance, of this dragon of fearing people who are different than you. And the trope does go too far sometimes where they're like, oh, nothing is evil, it's just different, right? But when you're looking at it in terms of a cultural or a racial context, which is where I think it comes from, it actually makes sense. And tolerance is a good thing. It's not an evil thing. So you're not endearing your child to evil. You're teaching them how to come out of their bubble and learn about other people and learn that maybe other people aren't as scary as you think they are.
Right. And so, that to that point, then that's why it is important to actually be more, how do you say, have a more nuanced understanding of the meaning of dragon, not just the what is of a dragon. No. What is the meaning of a dragon? And then it exists at different levels of awareness. You have the level of awareness of like How to Train Your Own Dragon, where it's assumed by the culture these things are evil. But actual attentive contact and respect with that thing shows, oh, it's not. We did not understand what it is, and we automatically assumed that it was something to be killed. This is something every culture, as it comes into contact with the symbols of another culture, has to now reevaluate: are our symbols as well articulated as we think they are what we think about life? Is it as good, or does it actually match up to reality? And I mean, that's what adults do, is we're constantly looking at what we've been passed down and given and testing it. Is it actually reality? But then there's the next level of awareness, which is this a thing that is bigger than me, that is something I am not honoring, that is something that could give me, for example, an edge in life, or could augment my ability to do something perhaps productive and good, and so living in harmony with it, like perhaps an atom bomb versus nuclear power. All right, one has the potential to do good, and one just doesn't when you abuse it, right?
Mhm.
But it's the same kind of dragon-like power that just so far exceeds the human capacity to actually control it. You must honor and respect that. And then there's the third level of dragoning, which is the sense of either ultimate spiritual evil in a Lovecraft demonic Satan sort of thing, or massive spiritual good that is like the ultimate version of that sense of there is no way you can control a being of ultimate power and ultimate chaos. Chaos in a good sense, not chaos in a
Mhm.
bad sense. Chaos that wants to be chaotic is bad. Chaos that allows, that is receptive to being ordered, that's good chaos. And that's the kind of chaos we see described in scripture a lot. That's the good
Mhm.
chaos. And there are dragons of that chaos because dragons exist as a language of the spiritual world. You
Mhm.
had a little story that you shared of an example of people not honor or allowing a difference of symbol. Can you share that? Because I think that's a very important little story just as we start wrapping up.
Yeah, I think that this is critically important, and it goes to the sort of fearful mindset. And I think it's understandable as parents, right? We really want to protect our children and we want to keep them very strong in their faith. But I think that there's definitely a danger of seeing things we don't know about, or seeing Satan in everything as opposed to
Mhm.
seeing God in everything. Because you have to remember that Satan only has good things to work with because he doesn't make anything. God makes things, right? So seeing a snake as evil, God made the snake.
Right.
It's not, the devil does not own it, and it doesn't need to always symbolize him, even though it does sometimes.
Well, have you seen Orthodox staffs, like when bishops kind of process in and out of the divine liturgy? They have snakes twisting around their staff and curling around. I stared at that thing when I realized what I was looking at. It's like, what is that, Father? And he's like, snakes are a symbol. I actually forget what he actually said, but it's that sense of snakes are something we honor and respect, and we have to learn to live carefully with. And any snake handler will tell you they're not bad. They're a creature. We honor them. They also communicate something about Christ. And Scripture says he was elevated like a serpent on a staff. So wait, is Christ bad? Well, of course not. So we use Christ to read back into what that symbol means. Sorry, go ahead.
Right. Yeah. And going back to the story, what this sort of paranoia um, of can do, I've seen it do much more harm than I've
Yeah.
seen it do good. And in this particular story, when I was going to Catholic college, JP Catholic, right, we lived in these apartments, and a lot of students lived in them, but they were part of the community, so there were other people there as well. And
Mhm.
across from the student lounge, one of the apartments was used as a lounge for the students. There was a family of South Asian immigrants. And they, for I think it was like a holiday or something, had drawn these beautiful floral mosaics in chalk just around their doorstep.
Oh wow.
Um, and as I was sitting there in the lounge, right, students come running in and they're like, "Oh my goodness, we saw these evil satanic symbols like across the way in front of somebody's door, and we trampled them out because they were, evil." Like they basically saw these things they didn't understand,
Mhm.
assumed they were satanic,
Mhm.
and just trampled them out, which was so unbelievably wrong. And we shouldn't be complaining about the judgmental Christian stereotype in movies when at the same time we're doing this sort of
Mhm.
thing.
Right.
Maybe instead of complaining about it, we should stop and think, why does that stereotype exist, and
Mhm.
what can we do to make sure that that stereotype doesn't represent reality anymore? Because to a
Mhm.
certain extent, unfortunately, it does.
Mhm. Yeah, exactly. So in that case, that's such a great example for uh, like the How to Train Your Own Dragon kind of dragon. They identified what they thought was a dragon. The rest of us would look at that and not see it as a problem, to be treated in that way. Maybe we don't understand it. We might actually learn about it and then decide we actually object to it in some other way. But we're not given the right to go out and deface it or like in the story, kill them. and take them off the board and get rid of them as if they have no place in creation. So in wrapping up, the key thing that is, I hope people sort of take away from this con, from being a part of our community, is to understand, first of all, there's almost always a sense of nuance that must be honored when it comes to pretty much any discussion around symbolism. And in keeping our focus here on dragons, there are at least 3 kinds of dragons. And when you pick up any book, the question is, what kind of dragon are we dealing with? I mean, that is the first response of a mature Christian, is what kind of dragon are we dealing with? Because it's the undeveloped, mind, the sense that hasn't read really enough stories, that puts them all in the one box and is afraid of all of them. And that's not what dragons are meant to be. I mean, if you read enough fairy tales, you're going to find a variety of different kinds of dragons, even in the Western tradition. So as far as in the First World West, this is kind of the tradition that we have about these things. So understand that there are 3 kinds. And this kind of Godzilla kind of a grounded, massive earth beast dragon has something to tell us. And it is something it's an extremely important lesson that we must learn. But then there are dragons in other cultures, how they honor them, how they integrate with them, how they revere them. Because again, a dragon is something that exists as an idea, or as not just an idea that we create, as an idea or a concept revealed to us and then wrapped in symbolic language so that we can make sense of the different dragons that exist all around us, and the different levels of our life. But I think in terms of raising our children, this is something to raise, like with my little girl, this is something that is now on my mind all the time, is what kind of stories do I want her to read? How do I want her to think about this sort of thing? To assume all dragons are Maleficent from Sleeping Beauty, this demonic being, does a disservice to the symbol and the richness of what dragoning is throughout all cultures, even within our own. Because again, liturgical dragons are used in one way. And I bet if we scratch deep enough, we're going to find contextually different versions of dragons in the same way that we do for lions. But I'm not 100% sure on that. But from a storytelling standpoint, I think it's very important to understand what are the nuances. And this is what storytellers, this is why this community, I believe, is one of the most important things, most enjoyable things that we're doing and we're working on together, is we have to understand the tools that we have to work with, what they mean to other people, what they can mean to us, and how we choose to use them. And if you're doing a story with dragons, identify what is the level of awareness of a dragon that we're using? What does it mean to the character? And you might even have all 3, and they might not be dragons that look like big lizards. Like in ancient Egypt, Set appears as kind of a big monstrous hippopotamus. It's effectively a dragon concept. Or Monstro in Pinocchio. It's a dragon concept. The symbol, the veiling of that symbol is a bit of a different thing, but it's this sense of a massive, powerful, chaotic reality that I can't control, and I have to either find a way to honor and respect that. Like with Godzilla, I stay out of your way, So, any last thoughts, Katie?
Yeah, I think that the most important thing that you can do, for your children, if you're a parent, or just with your friends, if you're maybe in the teen group, right, is when you're watching a movie or reading a book, before you say, oh, we can't read that book, it's bad or it's dangerous, right? Or before I let my kid watch this movie, I can't let them watch this movie, it's dangerous. I find that 90% of the time, of course, I have lines like everyone does, but 90% of the time, even if there's some content that might be problematic, I can usually have a conversation with my children about it as we go through. So if there was a dragon that, let's say, really was an embodiment of evil or something, I might say, is it smart that this kid is making friends with this dragon? And my daughter is she's smart. She can grasp this and understand it. And she would say, no, it's not smart, right? Or what do you think the dragon in this story represents? And we can have a conversation on that. And she's only 7 years old, right? She's not. So you can do this starting at a very young age, and your child, what's appropriate for them. But I'd say always default to the most positive interpretation of something if you're not sure, because doing the most negative interpretation, jumping straight to Satan, as they say, will lead to incidents like the one I shared at JP Catholic, and could very well lead to your child leaving Christianity because they think, oh, I was raised in such an intolerant society. So
Reductive
always default to God. Do not default to Satan.
Absolutely. I mean, I think it's 365 times it said in scripture, fear not. God came first. Satan's a parasite and has as much power in our daily lives anyway, as much power as we allow him to have. And if we're grounded in God first, and we see the original blessing of being created and being here, and faith, hope, and love being the most important things, and of course, love being the greatest of the three, then we have zero excuse to fear. That doesn't mean that we won't have fear, because angels will always appear and say, okay, it's okay. It's okay. I'm actually on your side. I'm good. I might look scary, but fear is a natural human response to things. But that is what mature and especially religious minds are trying to teach us, or living is trying to teach us, to not be afraid and to hold out a space of tolerance or understanding, or in the best case, love for everybody. So there you go. Dragons 101, our opinions. Know your dragons. And if you're going to write a dragon story, well, maybe share it with us. We would love to read that. And that's what our community is all about. If you've enjoyed this con so far, please continue to stick around, chat with people. And once the con is over, the fun doesn't end, because you can jump right into our Legend Fiction community. It's this creative community for Catholic and Orthodox fiction writers. You don't actually have to be writing anything. You can just sort of hang around and sort of wet your creative, whistle. But it is a place to give and get feedback, share your works in progress, and maybe double or triple your writing output, because we're having so much fun. And of course, there's dragons, and dragons are awesome. So till next time, God bless you and keep writing.